In 1936, the British establishment declared that a divorced woman becoming queen was absolutely, categorically, constitutionally impossible. They said it violated church doctrine. They said it offended the dominions. They said it would destabilize the empire itself. So, how exactly does Camilla have a crown on her head? That's the question. And once you start pulling at that thread, the whole tapestry unravels. Because what happened in 1936 wasn't about divorce. It wasn't about morality. It wasn't about the sacred institution of marriage. It was about power. About who gets to stay and who gets pushed out. And the rules, the ones they swore were ancient and immovable, those rules bent like wet cardboard the moment the establishment decided they wanted a different outcome. Let me show you how they did it. December 10th, 1936. Fort Belvedere, a Gothic revival estate near Windsor Great Park. King Edward VIII sits at a desk and signs the Instrument of Abdication in the presence of his 3 younger brothers. He's been king for 326 days. He's giving up the throne, the empire, everything, for Wallis Simpson, an American, a commoner, a woman with 2 living ex-husbands. The next day, Edward broadcasts to the nation from Windsor Castle. His voice cracks as he delivers the line that would define him forever. "I have found it impossible to carry the heavy burden of responsibility and to discharge my duties as king as I would wish to do without the help and support of the woman I love." Romantic, right? The greatest love story ever told. A king who sacrificed everything for the woman he adored. Except, that's not what happened. What happened was a coordinated operation to remove an inconvenient monarch, using the most defensible excuse available. And the excuse was divorce. Let's be specific about what they said. Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin told Edward directly, "The Queen becomes the queen of the country. Therefore, in the choice of a queen, the voice of the people must be heard." The cabinet refused to advise Parliament to accept Wallis Simpson. The governments of Canada, Australia, South Africa, New Zealand, and the Irish Free State were consulted and returned unanimous opposition. Cosmo Gordon Lang, the Archbishop of Canterbury, invoked Church of England doctrine from the Convocation of Canterbury in 1935. In no circumstances can Christian men or women remarry during the lifetime of a wife or a husband. In no circumstances. Those were his words. Wallis Simpson had 2 living ex-husbands. Her first marriage to Lieutenant Earl Winfield Spencer, Jr. ended in divorce in Virginia in 1927. Her second marriage to Ernest Simpson wasn't even fully dissolved when Edward proposed. She'd received her decree nisi on October 27, 1936, but under English law, that was only provisional. It wouldn't become final for 6 months. The King of England was proposing marriage to a woman who was still, technically, Mrs. Ernest Simpson. The establishment said no. They said it was impossible. They said the rules were clear. And then on May 6, 2023, Camilla Parker Bowles, divorced in 1995 from her first husband, Andrew Parker Bowles, after a 21-year marriage, sat in Westminster Abbey while the Archbishop of Canterbury placed the Queen Mary's crown on her head. She became Queen Camilla, consort to King Charles III. Same church, same throne, same rules, different outcome. But here's where it gets interesting. Because if you want to understand why Wallis was expelled and Camilla was embraced, you have to look at who else got called a commoner and what that word actually meant. When Lady Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon married Prince Albert, Duke of York, in 1923, the press coverage was rhapsodic. A commoner marrying a prince. How charmingly democratic of the royal family to accept an ordinary woman into their ranks. One problem. Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon's father was Claude Bowes-Lyon, the 14th Earl of Strathmore and Kinghorn. Her family seat was Glamis Castle in Scotland, a medieval fortress that had been in her family since 1372. The Bowes-Lyon family owned approximately 50,000 acres across Scotland and England. Elizabeth grew up attended by servants, educated by governesses, presented at court as a debutante. Her childhood was spent between a townhouse in London's St. James's Square and the ancient halls of Glamis. An earl's daughter, owner of a castle, connected by blood and marriage to the oldest aristocratic families in Britain, and they called her a commoner. In the narrow technical sense, they were right. Commoner, in British aristocratic terminology, means anyone not of royal blood. Every duke, marquis, earl, viscount, and baron in the kingdom is technically a commoner. But that's not what the word means to ordinary people. To ordinary people, commoner means common, regular, like us. So when the establishment called Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon a commoner, they meant it as a compliment. Look how the royal family welcomes the daughter of a mere earl. And when they called Wallis Simpson a commoner, they meant it as an insult. How dare this American woman presume to approach the throne? Same word, opposite meanings, based entirely on whether they wanted her in or out. Wallis Simpson was born Bessie Wallace Warfield on June 19, 1896, in Blue Ridge Summit, Pennsylvania. Her father died of tuberculosis when she was an infant. Her mother raised her in what biographers have called genteel poverty among wealthy Baltimore relatives, close enough to see how the other half lived, too far to join them. She grew up acutely aware that status was something to be won rather than inherited. She was not an earl's daughter. She didn't own a castle. She didn't have 50,000 acres, and the establishment never let her forget it. Archbishop Lang delivered a radio address on December 13, 1936, 2 days after the abdication. Listen to the contempt dripping from every word. Even more strange and sad it is that he should have sought his happiness in a manner inconsistent with the Christian principles of marriage, and within a social circle whose standards and ways of life are alien to all the best instincts and traditions of his people. Alien. That was the Archbishop of Canterbury's word for Wallis Simpson. Alien. Now, I need to tell you something that complicates this story considerably, because there's a reason the establishment wanted Edward gone that had nothing to do with divorce, and it involves Adolf Hitler. Less than a year after the abdication, in October 1937, the Duke and Duchess of Windsor made a 12-day tour of Nazi Germany as guests of the regime. They weren't tourists. They were received with full honors by the highest officials of the Third Reich. Deputy Führer Rudolf Hess hosted them. Propaganda Minister Joseph Goebbels entertained them. And on October 22, 1937, Edward and Wallis were received by Adolf Hitler himself at his Berchtesgaden mountain retreat. The photographs still exist. Edward giving the Nazi salute, not reluctantly, not ambiguously, with apparent enthusiasm. Hitler reportedly told associates that the Duchess would have made a good queen. This was not a naive mistake. Edward had expressed pro-German sympathies throughout the 1930s. He opposed rearmament. He advocated for appeasement. He maintained contacts with German officials when war was becoming increasingly likely. British intelligence services, MI5, had monitored his activities for years, concerned about both his political views and his indiscretion. Reports indicated that Edward had shared sensitive information with Nazi contacts. And then, it got worse. When France fell in June 1940, the Windsors fled to neutral Spain, then Portugal. Nazi Germany developed a plan, codenamed Operation Willy. to either persuade or kidnap Edward to serve as a puppet king following Germany's anticipated conquest of Britain. German agents approached him in Lisbon. Intercepted communications showed he was receptive to German overtures and made defeatist statements about Britain's chances in the war. The Nazi leadership believed, based on their contacts with Edward, that he would be willing to serve as a compliant monarch under German occupation. Winston Churchill, one of Edward's few defenders during the abdication, intervened directly to get him out of Europe. Edward was shipped off to the Bahamas as governor, a posting specifically designed to keep him far from Britain, far from the war, and far from any information that might be passed to the enemy. Even there, he continued telling American journalists that the war was unwinnable. The FBI monitored him on behalf of the British government. After Germany's defeat, American troops discovered a cache of documents in Windsor Castle containing detailed records of Nazi contacts with the Duke of Windsor. The Marburg Files. Churchill personally suppressed them. They remained classified for decades. So let me ask you something. Do you think the British establishment forced out a king because his intended bride had been divorced twice? Or do you think maybe, just maybe, they forced out a king who was a security risk, whose sympathies lay with Britain's enemies, and whose continued reign posed a genuine threat to national security on the eve of the most destructive war in human history? Divorce was the stated reason because it was simple, traditional, defensible. The real reasons were too dangerous to say out loud. But the rules about divorced women being unable to become queen, those rules got weaponized, and then they got applied again. Princess Margaret, younger sister of Elizabeth II, third in line to the throne. In the early 1950s, she fell in love with Group Captain Peter Townsend, a genuine war hero, decorated for his service as an RAF fighter pilot during the Battle of Britain. He was handsome, accomplished, devoted to Margaret, and divorced. His wife had left him for another man in 1952, making Townsend the innocent party in the divorce. But it didn't matter. The same rules invoked to expel Edward were now invoked to prevent Margaret's marriage. Churchill, the same Churchill who had defended Edward's right to marry in 1936, argued that the principles which prevented Wallis Simpson from becoming queen should prevent Margaret from marrying a divorced man while retaining her royal status. The Church of England's position was cited repeatedly, that 1935 doctrine. In no circumstances can Christian men or women remarry during the lifetime of a wife or a husband. Margaret could contract a civil marriage if she renounced her succession rights, but that would exile her from royal life. On October 31st, 1955, Margaret issued her public statement. I have been aware that, subject to my renouncing my rights of succession, it might have been possible for me to contract a civil marriage. But, mindful of the Church's teaching that Christian marriage is indissoluble, and conscious of my duty to the Commonwealth, I have resolved to put these considerations before any others. Peter Townsend went into exile abroad. The rules that ended Edward's reign ended Margaret's chance at happiness. Those rules, mindful of the Church's teaching, Christian marriage is indissoluble. Remember those rules, because they're about to evaporate. Camilla Rosemary Shand met Prince Charles in 1970 or 1971 at a polo match in Windsor Great Park. Her opening line has become legendary. My great-grandmother was the mistress of your great-great-grandfather. I feel we have something in common. She was talking about Alice Keppel, one of King Edward VII's most famous mistresses. The joke was more prophetic than she knew. Charles and Camilla began a relationship, but marriage wasn't considered. Charles was the heir to the throne, expected to marry someone suitable. In 1973, while Charles was away on naval duty, Camilla married Andrew Parker Bowles, an army officer who had previously dated Princess Anne. They had 2 children, Tom in 1974, Laura in 1978. Charles married Lady Diana Spencer on July 29, 1981. She was 19, beautiful, aristocratic, and met every traditional criterion that Wallis Simpson had violated. 750 million people watched the ceremony worldwide. Within 5 years, Charles had resumed his relationship with Camilla. Diana later described finding, on her honeymoon, photographs of Camilla among Charles's belongings, and a bracelet inscribed with the initials G and F, standing for Gladys and Fred, pet names Charles and Camilla used for each other. Throughout the 1980s, the affair continued while Charles and Diana presented a public facade and produced 2 sons, William in 1982, Harry in 1984. And then the facade didn't just crack, it exploded. In January 1993, a British tabloid published transcripts of an intercepted phone call between Charles and Camilla. The conversation had been recorded in 1989. It was intimate, explicit, and it included Charles expressing the wish to be reincarnated as one of Camilla's personal items, specifically, a tampon. The Camillagate tapes, as they became known, created a scandal that went beyond embarrassment. This was the heir to the throne, the future Supreme Governor of the Church of England, caught on tape in graphic conversation with a married woman. The same establishment that had declared divorced women unsuitable for royalty was now confronted with evidence of sustained adultery at the highest level. Constitutional scholars debated whether Charles could even become king. If the Church's position on divorce was truly principled, if it really was about the sanctity of marriage, how could a confessed adulterer head that church? How could a man who had violated his own marriage vows serve as defender of the faith? The answer, it turned out, was easily. You just wait. 1992. The year Elizabeth II would call her annus horribilis. Prince Andrew and Sarah Ferguson announced their separation in March. Princess Anne's divorce from Mark Phillips became final in April. Windsor Castle caught fire in November. And in December, Prime Minister John Major announced in the House of Commons that the Prince and Princess of Wales were separating. Diana gave her famous Panorama interview in November 1995. 23 million people in Britain alone watched her tell Martin Bashir, "There were 3 of us in this marriage, so it was a bit crowded." 3 of us. Everyone knew who the 3rd person was. Camilla divorced Andrew Parker Bowles in March 1995. Charles and Diana divorced in 1996. And then, on August 31st, 1997, Diana died in a car crash in Paris. The public reaction to Diana's death was volcanic, and it was directed in large part at Camilla. She became the most hated woman in Britain. Tabloid headlines called her a homewrecker. Polls showed that a majority of the British public opposed Charles ever becoming king if it meant Camilla becoming queen. She received death threats. She was spat at in public. She retreated almost entirely from view, unable to appear anywhere without risking confrontation. This was the woman they said could never be accepted, the woman whose relationship with Charles was, in the public mind, directly connected to Diana's unhappiness and indirectly to her death. The woman who represented everything the establishment claimed to oppose: adultery, divorce, the destruction of a royal marriage. And yet, the rehabilitation of Camilla Parker Bowles is one of the most successful public relations operations in modern British history. It was deliberate, it was strategic, and it was run by a man named Mark Boland. Boland joined the Prince of Wales's household in 1996 as assistant private secretary. His real job was reputation management. Specifically, making the British public accept that Charles would eventually marry Camilla, and that Camilla would eventually become queen. The strategy was incremental. First, normalize Charles and Camilla being seen together. Their first public appearance as a couple came in January 1999, leaving the Ritz Hotel after a birthday party. The photograph was staged. Boland had tipped off the press in advance. He wanted that picture in every newspaper because he knew that familiarity breeds acceptance. Next, soften Camilla's image. Stories appeared in sympathetic outlets portraying her as warm, funny, down-to-earth. Nothing like the scheming villainess of tabloid imagination. She was photographed with charity workers, with children, with dogs, always smiling, never defensive. Then address the elephant in the room, the church. Because the rules that had destroyed Edward VIII and Princess Margaret were still technically on the books. The Church of England still officially opposed remarriage after divorce. If those rules applied to Camilla the way they'd applied to Wallis Simpson, the crown was impossible. So the rules changed. In July 2002, the General Synod of the Church of England voted to allow clergy, at their discretion, to remarry divorced people in church, even if their former spouse was still alive. The vote was 269 to 83 in the House of Laity, and similar margins in the houses of bishops and clergy. Read that again. The doctrine that Archbishop Lang had called absolute, in no circumstances, was overturned by a vote. A committee meeting, a show of hands. The sacred principle that had ended a king's reign and broken a princess's heart turned out to be adjustable, flexible, subject to revision when the establishment decided it was time. And who was lobbying the church during this period? Whose interests did this rule change serve? The timing was not coincidental. On February 10, 2005, Clarence House announced the engagement of Prince Charles and Camilla Parker Bowles. The wedding would take place on April 8 at Windsor Castle, except it couldn't, because the legal situation was a mess. The Marriage Act of 1836, which had established civil marriage in England, explicitly stated that members of the royal family were exempt from its provisions. Royal marriages required the sovereign's consent under the Royal Marriages Act of 1772, but the mechanism for that consent was ecclesiastical ceremony, not civil registry. No member of the royal family had ever married in a civil ceremony. The legal advice Charles received suggested it might not even be possible. The Lord Chancellor's office scrambled to produce an opinion stating that the Human Rights Act of 1998 had effectively overridden the 1836 exemption, that denying Charles the right to a civil marriage would violate his human rights. Constitutional lawyers disputed this interpretation. The government eventually issued a statement that it was confident the marriage would be legal. Confident, not certain, confident. The wedding venue changed from Windsor Castle, a royal residence where civil ceremonies definitely couldn't occur, to Windsor Guildhall, a public building where they probably could. The date moved from April 8th to April 9th because April 8th was the funeral of Pope John Paul II, and Charles needed to attend. The Queen declined to attend the civil ceremony, though she did host the reception afterward. The Archbishop of Canterbury, Rowan Williams, did not perform the wedding, because even with the 2002 rule change, there was resistance within the church to marrying the heir to the throne to a divorced woman in a religious ceremony. Instead, Williams conducted a service of prayer and dedication at St. George's Chapel following the civil ceremony. A blessing, not a wedding. The distinction mattered. It preserved the fiction that the church's position on divorce remained principled, while allowing the practical outcome the establishment wanted. Camilla became Duchess of Cornwall. Notably, she didn't take the title Princess of Wales, even though she was legally entitled to it. That title was too associated with Diana. The public wasn't ready. The rehabilitation still had work to do. For 17 years, Camilla served as a working royal. Charity engagements, official visits, the slow, grinding work of appearing normal, appearing acceptable, appearing inevitable. In February 2022, on the eve of her Platinum Jubilee, Queen Elizabeth II made an announcement. When Charles became king, she said, Camilla should be known as Queen Consort, not Princess Consort, the title Camilla had been promised at the time of her marriage. Queen Consort. Elizabeth had resisted giving Wallis Simpson even the basic dignity of Her Royal Highness. She had denied her sister Margaret the man she loved because of church doctrine on divorce. And now, at the end of her life, she endorsed Camilla for the title that Wallis Simpson had been told was constitutionally impossible. 7 months later, Elizabeth was dead. Charles was king. And on May 6, 2023, in Westminster Abbey, the Archbishop of Canterbury placed the Queen Mary's crown on Camilla's head. The same crown, the same church, the same office, different rules. Think about what that means. In 1936, they said the church forbade it. In 2002, the church voted to allow it. In 1936, they said the dominions wouldn't accept it. In 2022, nobody asked the dominions. In 1936, they said a divorced woman as queen would destabilize the monarchy. In 2023, the monarchy is doing just fine. In 1955, Princess Margaret was told Christian marriage is indissoluble. In 2005, the heir to the throne had a civil marriage blessed by the Archbishop. The rules were never rules. They were excuses, applied when convenient, discarded when convenient, weaponized against people the establishment wanted gone, ignored for people the establishment wanted to keep. Wallis Simpson wasn't denied the throne because she was divorced. She was denied the throne because she was American, because she was sharp-tongued, because she came from the wrong people, because she didn't know her place, and most importantly, because she was attached to a king the establishment desperately needed to remove before he handed Britain to the Nazis on a silver platter. Divorce was just the public relations version. And here's the thing that should make you furious. When Edward and Wallis married on June 3, 1937, at the Château de Condé in France, King George VI issued letters patent declaring that while Edward would be styled His Royal Highness, this title would not extend to his wife. Every other wife of a king's son in British history received that title automatically. Wallis Simpson was specifically excluded. A deliberate humiliation. A final act of petty cruelty against a woman whose real crime was being inconvenient. They treated her like a disease, an alien, a social circle whose standards and ways of life are alien to all the best instincts and traditions of his people. And then, 86 years later, they put a crown on Camilla, the woman who had been the most hated in Britain, the woman who had been booed in the streets, the woman who represented adultery, divorce, the violation of a royal marriage. She got the crown that Wallis Simpson was told could never exist. Not because the rules changed, because the rules were never real in the first place. This is what institutions do. They create the appearance of principle to justify whatever they've already decided. The principle becomes tradition. The tradition becomes sacred. And then, one day, when the principle becomes inconvenient, it vanishes like morning fog. Nobody apologizes. Nobody admits they were wrong. They just quietly move the goalposts and dare you to notice. The General Synod voted 269 to 83. That's how sacred the principle was. That's how eternal the doctrine turned out to be. A committee meeting, a show of hands, and suddenly, in no circumstances, became in some circumstances, became in most circumstances, became in whatever circumstances suit us. Wallis Simpson died on April 24, 1986, in Paris. She was buried at Frogmore near Windsor Castle, next to the man who gave up an empire for her. She never received the title, Her Royal Highness. She was never accepted. She was never forgiven. Camilla stands where Wallis was told no woman like her could ever stand. The crown Wallis Simpson was told she could never wear is now on Camilla's head. The rules were never rules. They were excuses. And now you know. Subscribe for more stories like this.